The danger in defining the Gothic simply by its conventions is that, quite simply, not every Gothic work is going to have all the conventions. So one may not have a castle, but is it still Gothic? So we may be better served to try to talk about what the Gothic actually does rather than simply defining it by its content. I don't want to get overly theoretical here, but I do want to introduce a couple of concepts that might prove useful as we talk about this week's poems. I've mentioned Anne Radcliffe as the originator of the Gothic craze of the 1790s, and she provides an interesting distinction between what she calls terror and horror. Terror we can characterize as the fear of the unknown. The author creates a kind of uncertainty, and uncertainty is a feature of the Burkean sublime. So that we're not quite sure what it is that we're afraid of or what's going to happen next. And Radcliffe sees this strategy as one that very much opens up and enlivens the reader. As she puts it, it expands the soul and awakens the faculties to a high degree of life. If we're talking about modern equivalents, the thriller films where you know that something is going to happen, but you're not quite sure what it is, when it's going to happen. It's the suspense that drives that kind of film. And for Radcliffe, it should be clear that this is much superior to horror. The terror is what the Gothic writer should try to create in the reader. So distinguishing that from horror, which is the direct depiction of a frightening object, where you actually see the monster, you see the blood and gore, the worms coming out of the corpse, and so on. So in horror, the author often shocks the reader with sometimes graphic images. Radcliffe is thinking particularly of the likes of Matthew Lewis, who writes a novel called The Monk, which is very much intended as in opposition to the Radcliffean ideal of terror. Lewis gives very graphic depictions of horror. But for Radcliffe, these images contract, freeze, and nearly annihilate the faculties. That instead of the opening up of the soul that we get from terror, in horror we just kind of curl up into a ball and try to protect ourselves. That we don't have a kind of productive experience engaging with horror. And the modern equivalent here would be the slasher film, where you actually see all the blood and gore. And from a Radcliffean point of view, there tends to be a lack of any kind of sophistication in the narrative. So, turning to a more contemporary theorist, Julia Kristeva in the 20th century talked about the concept of abjection, which can be very useful to an understanding of the Gothic. For Kristeva, abjection is the process of throwing off and disavowing aspects of the self that one does not want to acknowledge. And in the process, that exposes the fluid line between the self and the other. So for Kristeva, the abject is what inhabits the space between the subject, who is me, and the object, which is anything that is not me. So what inhabits the space in between? As Kristeva talks about, it talks about this in physical terms, about bodily waste, blood, anything that comes out of the body, we no longer see as being ourselves, but clearly has still has come from us. So abjection is concerned with the process of trying to preserve the integrity of the subject by disavowing its connection to the abject. But the abject remains disturbing, the sign of the impossibility of fully dividing the self from the other. And this is also true in psychological terms, that anything that we do not accept as part of ourselves, but also cannot entirely reject, things that we deep down acknowledge is part of us. So how is this significant for the Gothic? Another contemporary critic, Gerald E. Hogel, talks extensively about the Gothic in terms of abjection. So Hogel argues that the Gothic responds to these contradictory cultural impulses to both reject and acknowledge versions of identity that deviate from the norm. That within culture we have a wide variety of ideologies and beliefs in relation to different concepts of identity. And the Gothic works through those sometimes very contradictory and differing ideas. Just giving one passage from Hogel here. He says, the Gothic clearly exists in part to acknowledge that all abnormalities we would divorce from ourselves deeply and pervasively, hence frighteningly, even while it provides quasi-antiquated methods to help us place such deviations at a definite, though haunting, distance from us. So the point here is that anything that is abnormal or deviant or different, there is the cultural tendency to both try to divorce ourselves from that, to separate ourselves off and say that's not me, that's not us, but at the same time being acknowledging and trying to incorporate those differences into a worldview. So that's why Hogel puts this emphasis on deviations, putting deviations at a definite though haunting distance from us. The Gothic helps to cast off things, to abject the different, but at the same time, the Gothic is also constantly reminding us of those differences. So in the context of the Gothic, what happens is that all those anxieties that trouble the contemporary world are projected onto the other, which can take many different forms. For example, in the Romantic period, Gothic novels tended to be set in Mediterranean countries, where the English believed that people were slaves to their passions, unlike the orderly and the orderly English, who don't have passions like that. But of course, the whole point is that if the writing of these texts is also an acknowledgement that yes, they do. And we are very often invited to identify with this other within Gothic texts. I've mentioned Frankenstein in a previous class, and Frankenstein's creature is coded as being foreign, as being other, inhuman. There's emphasis, for example, on its yellow skin, and it represents a horror of those who look different. But at the same time, we are in this novel brought to see the world from his point of view. So we have the abjection of what is other, but also the rendering sympathetic of otherness. So we might ask, is the Gothic a subversive literary form? And the answer I'm suggesting here is a decided yes and no. On the one hand, Gothic works function by reminding us of what troubles our boundaries, what disturbs us, what prevents us from thinking of ourselves in a completely coherent way. On the other hand, they also often function to obscure the real source of those anxieties. It's no coincidence that the bloodshed of the French Revolution in 1789 preceded a decade full of horrific fantasies about murder, the ghosts of murder victims, the threat of tyrannical institutions. The Catholic Church, for example, was the site of the abjection of much of these horrors. But of course, there's a continuum at work here. Some Gothic texts may be more or less subversive than others. So what we really need to do in looking at Gothic Romantic texts is to study the way in which they treat these boundary-challenging phenomena. Do they seek to exploit the full potential of the challenge raised by the Gothic, or do they seek to contain it and prevent its representations from becoming too disturbing? To give just one example, we can think of the lyrical ballads again here. There are a number of poems in lyrical ballads that depict seemingly supernatural events. But with Wordsworth framing the poems with a preface that insists on a rational framework from which these poems can be understood, or in the case of The Thorn, a poem within the lyrical ballads, insisting that the narrator of a poem is particularly superstitious, which is why it might seem supernatural. Wordsworth, using these strategies, is able to distance himself from this Gothicism. So in looking at this week's poems, we want to think about both the nature of the Gothic representations, but also the extent to which they may be framed in a way that contains the potential danger of those representations.